Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's collective worship. Peace be with you. Well, you all know the theme of this term by now. We're thinking about perseverance. And I'm sure mums and dads, if you're listening to this at home, you're finding perseverance a bit difficult at the moment with all this homeschooling. And, you all might be finding it really hard to be at home rather than at school with your friends, and those of you that are in school are probably finding it just as hard as well. We're all having to show a bit of perseverance at the moment as we deal with the situation we're in. But let's hope things are moving forwards and things will change again soon. This morning I want to talk about someone whose Saints' Day we celebrated on the 25th, just 3 days ago on Monday. Someone who, when we hear his story, you might think, why on earth would the church be celebrating that person? Because this person was not a nice person when we first hear about him, but by the end of it, he had changed completely. Some of you might know who that person was, and you might even be whispering it to one another now. But on Monday, we celebrated St. Paul's Day. But when we first hear about Paul in the Bible, he's not called Paul, he's called Saul. And Saul was a Jew and he was a zealot. And zealots were a group of Jews who were fanatical in persecuting people that didn't believe the same as they are. And Paul was one of the worst persecutors of all. Paul hated anyone that didn't go along with what he wanted, who didn't have the same beliefs as he did. And he was almost known as the chief persecutor because of the way he persevered and was persistent in making sure that those he didn't like were either beaten up, thrown into jail, tortured, and in some cases even killed. And people hated Paul and they didn't want to be anywhere near him. You certainly wouldn't want Paul living in your street or in your house next door, because he was probably listening and watching to see what you were doing. And there was one group of people that Saul hated more than anyone else, and that was Christians. He really couldn't stand the Christians because they didn't believe what he believed. You see, he didn't believe at that point that there was anyone called Jesus Christ. He believed that Jesus might be coming, but not that he had been already. And so he made it his job to get rid of as many Christians as he could. And he was very busy making sure that they were persecuted. But one day Saul had to make a journey. And he was going down the road, he was going to the next town, probably to persecute a few more Christians and do nasty and horrible things to them. Such was his nature. But as he was going down the road, suddenly he was blinded by a massive bright light. And a voice which said, "Saul, Saul." And Saul was petrified, because if you were Saul, how did you know this wasn't your enemy? How did you know someone wasn't going to get their own back for what you'd done to him? And Paul fell to his knees and was trembling on the floor before this voice. And yeah, you've probably guessed it. It was the voice of God. Because just as Paul had been persevering in his persecution of Christians, so God had been persevering with Paul. And he said to Paul, "You're going to go and stay in a house in the nearby town, and I will come to you, and things will change." Well, Paul couldn't see, so there wasn't a lot he could do, and he was taken to the house and he was there, and the owner of the house spoke to him. And then Paul came to realise that actually there was something about this God. That the God who had persevered with him really was following. And he believed in Jesus. He believed that Jesus was the Son of God. And his eyes were opened and he could see again. And you might think, well, Paul would just go back to doing what he was doing before. But he didn't. Instead of persevering in persecuting people, Paul now perseveres in telling everyone he met about the good news of Jesus Christ. And he travelled through many countries and through many regions. And he wrote a lot of letters to the Corinthians, to the Ephesians, and lots of other people, telling them about the love of God. And he brought many other people to know Jesus Christ. He was arrested by the Romans for doing so, the very people he'd helped to begin with. And he was shipwrecked off the coast of Malta. And he eventually ended up in a prison in Rome. But Paul changed. And why did Paul change? Paul changed because God persevered with Paul. God knew that Paul was worth persevering for. However bad Paul had been, God still loved him, and he knew that he could make a difference in Paul's life, and that Paul could use the bad perseverance and the bad behaviour he persisted in before to actually turn that around and do the same, but behaving in the right and proper way and spreading the good news of Jesus Christ. And that's the true story, that God never gives up on us. God always perseveres with us, and we can persevere in getting to know God as well. So that's why we celebrate St. Paul, because yes, he did persevere in doing wrong, but when he found God and when God persevered in finding him, he changed to spread the good news of the gospel to everyone that was out there. And it just goes to show that God never gives up on us. He can see the good in every one of us, and he will change us if we let him. So let's just take some time to be quiet and some time to pray. Dear God, we thank you that you never give up on us. You are always persevering with us in whatever we do. Help us to use that same degree of perseverance so that others may know that we love you in the things that we do and in the things that we say. Amen. Well, let's carry on persevering. Let's carry on being persistent in our persevering. How many times can I use a P word in this thing? You might like to listen to this again and count the number of P words. If you know, tell your teacher and get her to send them to me, and I'll count them as well and see if we've got it right. Let's just see how much we're persevering here together. Have a good week. Enjoy it, whatever you're doing. Who knows, we might get some more snow. That will be great fun, wouldn't it? But until next week, bye for now.